we'll have time for some Q&A. Thank you so much, guys.
Hello, everyone. Quick introductions. We're not losing much time. And the full bios are both available online as well as, I think, appearing behind us as we speak. So, Jenny Sargent works as a managing director for First Draft, I think one of the landmark initiatives in the fight against online disinformation, with its flagship project, or one of its flagship projects, called Crosscheck, which mainly materializes around elections, and you are also running a workshop right after this session upstairs, and we're looking forward to that one. Dhruv Gulati is CEO and founder of Factma, which is I would say, tech startup, mainly focusing on AI and algorithmic-driven tools to fight online misinformation. Phil Chatwin is Global News Director with Agence France Presse, so let's say legacy media transiting to digital. I think AFP is active in almost all collaborative initiatives around online disinformation, like the Trust Project, Journalism Trust Initiative, Crosscheck, and many others. And Natalia Antelava is founder and CEO of Coda Stories, which puts out stories for context. I was reading your About section of the website. It sensed a bit like, I would call it slow news. I don't know if you agree, but this is how it comes across. Right. So in order to get anywhere near meeting the, I would say, insanely ambitious challenge of running this panel with 4 acclaimed speakers and only 40 minutes, I think we can do this for the whole evening. We decided on 2 things. One was to drop all slides and sales pitches and get right into the conversation. And the second thing was to kind of spin off my part, the Journalism Trust Initiative, into a separate workshop. So I'll be the moderator only and not a 5th panelist. Right, so to kick this off, I was thinking of a radically disruptive question, maybe even more daring with all the big logos on the panes behind me, so hold on everyone. Is there anything the platforms got right? Is there anything good they did in the last years and helped us along the way in fighting online disinformation, Dhruv?
Hi guys. So I think is there anything good that they've done? First of all, I've seen in the last kind of year and a half a massive increase in actual proactive discussion around this problem. When FactMatter was started, sort of basically at the end of 2016, really it was the beginning of that conversation. I'm now seeing at every single journalism conference like this, there is discussions around the problem, and you see the big platforms trying to engage and trying to reach out beyond themselves to try and get some advice on how to solve these problems. I think people who, on the panel will agree that that's kind of, especially with Crosscheck and so on, there's been a lot of collaboration. When it comes to fact-checking partnerships, we've seen an increase in that. The scale of these operations to try and tackle this problem is absolutely massive. So I think, it's the first time we're actually trying to size, how much money is spent on these platforms on things like trust and safety and moderation. It's in the billions, right? And I think that's something that there is, for any large corporation, a big sizable amount of stomach, and that's increasing more and more. Things that they've done well, I think, starting to, again, partner up with fact-checkers, partnering up internationally as well. And I think, in general, also the shutting up of accounts. I think there were some statistics that Twitter has been shutting down about last July 2018, 1 million accounts a day. And that's been increasing more and more. So I think there's more work to be done, but I definitely think that they've been taking a stand on it.
Mm-hmm. What are the others' experiences? I think from a consumer's or media journalist maybe point of view, you always get the impression that Facebook doesn't leave out any opportunity to shoot itself in the foot while Google seems to be, managing kind of to steering away from troubled waters. Is that also the experience you have, like, working with them?
That's what I was going to say, actually, is they're very different, and their approaches are very different. And I think just saying the platforms, the same way as we object to all being referred to as the publishers, I think there is definitely ways where they could work closer together to address a lot of these problems. Just taking the Pelosi video that Amy just alluded to, their responses were wildly different. The policies clearly aren't in place. My frustration is that they are listening and they are taking great care to, host these events and be more participatory, which is very positive. My frustration is to hear that, these are new ethical challenges. They're not, actually. A lot of newsrooms could really help them with some of these editorial decisions. I remember 3 years ago when the big discussion was around the ethics of live streaming and showing the moment of death. There was a series of videos which kind of prompted discussion around that. And we'd hear from Facebook, this is very new and we don't know how to tackle it. And you just felt like saying, just ask the newsrooms who've been dealing with this for a really long time. So I'm very grateful for the openness and the transparency, and I have to give them credit for that and for listening. I just sometimes think some of these questions, which would make them a publisher, and therefore it makes it an editorial decision, which is why we never get any further, but that would be welcome.
I take your point. I agree with you, Jenny, but I think we also forget how far they've come in terms of, you've got to really look at 2016 and the US election. And remember, we forget very quickly what the attitude pre-2016 was. It was very much, we're a platform, your media, we really don't even speak to you. There's very little contact at all. So I think one of the most interesting things is post-2016 is that they own the problem, and I think that's a major step forward. Before it was our problem, and I think what's really interesting is a sense of responsibility and understanding that the problem is with the big tech companies, and that they are going to have to find solutions with us, but that they're going to have to find solutions. And for me, that's a big change, and I can feel it's easy just to forget quite where we were in 2016, where you could go to media conference after media conference and there'd almost be an empty chair where you wanted the person from Facebook to be, so we could all ask these questions. So yeah, everybody wants to go faster, but you also have to look at the context a little and see where it's come from, I think.
Talking about an empty chair, what about Apple? Has any one of you engaged with them? Obviously, they have a product out, Apple News, or anyone in the room, any meaningful engagement with Apple so far?
I think their strategy amongst the platforms is different. They've very publicly, when they actually released that relaunch of the Apple News product, it was very much, we don't have this problem because we have human people going through and thinking about all of these decisions, and so we should be out of this discussion. That's been my
and very much, we're not a data company. They really go far out of their way to say we're not a data company in that way, to differentiate themselves from some of the other players. But I think now they're with Apple News, they're probably walking into the same issues that they're going to have that the other platforms are dealing with.
I actually would like to address the question. I want to slightly disrupt your disruptive question and question whether this is the right question to be asking a tool. I mean, the title of the panel is, are there our friends or are there our enemies, right? Or frenemies. And I think it really distracts from the question we should be, as an industry, asking ourselves is how do we as an industry contribute to online disinformation? We seem to have this expectation. I mean, I don't know, does it matter whether they're neither? They're platforms, they're businesses, they have their business, we know what it is that they're doing, and we have entered as an industry kind of this soul-searching relationship with the platforms that I think detracts us from the problems that we should be facing, like what are we doing to contribute to disinformation? You mentioned Koda's slow news. I mean, yeah, that's right. I do not like the term slow news because I think, news is news, and most of the time news just doesn't happen 24 hours, and we are not examining enough the damage that we're doing by this like incredibly fast news cycle. Or, you know, what happens when we, I mean, I don't want to pick on Jen, but I have to pick on Jen. What happens when we invite Sputnik to our industry conferences, even if they are in a business booth? You know, the big part of their business is online disinformation. And I look forward to a question from the Sputnik lady after we are done here. So I think we should be asking more of these questions to ourselves and think harder about, you know, instead of jumping on the regulation bandwagon, I think we should also be thinking harder about how we cover these platforms and how we tell their story. And I think we should be investing more into algorithm literacy and actually not relying on them to tell us what their algorithms are, but figuring out what they are. You know, so yes, they have a lot more money. They're playing an incredibly important role. They're not just a business. It's a very uncomfortable relationship. But I think there is a lot that we can be doing as an industry to gain much more of an equal footing in our conversations with the platforms.
So just to add one more point. We were talking about the empty seat at these conferences, right? So, you know, again, when starting starting Fat Matter early, you know, late 2016, it wasn't clear who was the person responsible. What is their role? What is the name of the division that they run? Typically, it was the trust and safety team. Then you'd see a new team pop up called information integrity. They all differ in terms of the different platforms. When engaging with some of the platforms, there'd also be different phases of maturity in terms of how they were thinking about policies, how they were thinking about how they dealt with governments, how they dealt with publishers. I think one of the challenges that we need to solve with the platforms is that they actually need to collaborate more. This is a cross-platform problem. I have not seen much of that. And, you know, maybe someone can prove me wrong, but I haven't seen that kind of collaboration. And that's very important for us to standardize. What is the role of the person who's dealing with this problem? Is it the CISO, for example, as well?
Now, collaboration can be voluntary or induced by external pressure. And I think lashing out at platforms, calling for regulation is pretty much mainstream these days. But the next question, like what exactly do you want to regulate and how, seems to be pretty much in the open. So preempting legislation, keeping governments from doing crazy laws might be one collaborative thing to do, maybe even together with platforms. But what exactly, in your personal views, are the objectives of regulations, and what should regulation, first, what problem should regulation solve, if that's a question, and how exactly can we achieve this? I mean, if, and that happens, politicians ask us, like, tell us what to do.
I think it's a very confused and dangerous area, because I think different issues get mixed up together. I think one of the things we're seeing at the moment is tremendous pressure on the technology companies over different issues. There's the misinformation, disinformation issue, but there's also the financial issue of the media business model having been wiped out. And those two things sort of go hand in hand, and it's tempting for governments and regulation to try and resolve both those issues in one fell swoop. I think what's interesting is the context that's created by the pressure on the technology companies. And therefore, that opens the door, I think, to conversations which, you know, happen, in a sense, to prevent regulation, but happen between us and them to chart a way forward. I mean, the media has no future without Google and Facebook. They are our lives. We are intertwined with them. You know, we cannot, you know, they are the future of journalism. So we have to find a way forward with them. And it's much better through a negotiated and discussion process than through any kind of legislative process, I think, which will become messy and confused and probably not achieve the aims set out for it.
I think I'm really interested. I've got a personal obsession with like threat modeling and risk assessments and checklists. I'm really dull to work with, because I learned this from an InfoSec trainer who, when I first started working in this space, I said, I need a Tor browser and I need PGP email and I need a thing over my computer lens and you know, I'm under threat. And she said, what are you under threat from? And you need to work that through, and you need to come up with a kind of resilient strategy to ensure that you're not overreacting or over-responding. And I'm so interested in this regulation debate because it's different country by country. The impact and the challenges are vastly different depending on where you are in the world. And I would love to do some kind of fire drill scenarios in each country with members from the platforms and the governments and community leaders who are directly targeted by a lot of these manipulation campaigns, and just kind of work through some crisis scenarios and say, what's the worst that can happen and what are we regulating against really? There's some really interesting footage from the Facebook giving evidence in Singapore and being pushed to respond based on the evidence they gave. And the Facebook wherever it was, I don't know whether it was UK or US, but the evidence, the representative from Facebook was saying, why are you asking me? I thought I was here to talk about Singapore. And I sort of took his point. I didn't enjoy watching that exchange. I don't think they came off particularly well, but I'm interested in let's take it on a case-by-case basis and assess what that threat is and how urgent that threat is and what immediate actions need to be taken. We're just treading water because it seems too big. So, again, a threat model perhaps.
But looking at these current calls, and I think this will boil up even during the primaries in the US and even further, to break up Google or Facebook or both, do you think it makes sense? And if yes, breaking up, how exactly?
I mean, I have a different view to you. I think that this is actually an opportunity for publishers. This is a major chance to actually change the face of this industry at this time. I'm not saying that it's in an adversarial way, but if you look at things like the cybersecurity market, for example, there is some element of pressurization, whether it comes from people talking about the problem or people talking about how much you're at threat, and this attack, this virus hit you or this malware hit you. And that creates a sense of actually wanting to do something about the problem. And I think it needs that push. I don't think that I think it's a very complex problem, and it's going to take time. But for example, governments like Singapore take a very proactive stance on this problem compared to all the other ones, and they've been working with all the different media companies within the country, working with the information security groups, working with the Defense Ministry, the Election Commission, and actually starting that dialogue in a proactive, directed way. I think this is a chance to actually force platforms to actually start to, take a stand on it.
You'd find Singapore fairly low down the charts of RSF's Press Freedom Index, for example. I think that's the danger. Is that when everything becomes, slightly mixed up into the legislative process, it's likely to take a wrong direction.
Natalia, coming back to your point earlier, taking this situation as a collective look into the mirror and first ask ourselves, what can we do as a profession and industry? What I find really kind of noteworthy that, for example, no matter at which media company you start asking, they all struggle with engaging with younger audiences. If you talk to media literacy activists, by reflex, everybody would think of school children first. Now, latest research points, if we speak about disinformation, rather the opposite way, that age group 60 plus excels in spreading crap, allegedly because they have more time, they might be lonely, they might even, with age, and people tend to live longer, so this age group is growing, might even, be subject to dementia, etc., etc. So all this piling up and playing into the spreading of falsehood and misinformation. So how, as a profession, can we engage with this particular age group and get things right?
I don't really have clear answers, obviously, although I think we might want to look at Russia for some ideas, because I think one thing that the Russian state TV has done very, very successfully is actually engage the pensioners. They are their main, it's kind of the main audience and and it played out in very dramatic ways in places like Eastern Ukraine or Crimea, where this like elderly population was definitely carrying that wave of protest. You know, I was covering the war in Eastern Ukraine for the BBC, and it would always be, you know, a handful of babushkas protesting, and it would always start with like this older women who are like really pumped with energy from the. And maybe we should actually be paying more attention to the elderly, because, I mean, in some ways, young people are always a bit of a lost cause. I think every generation of newsrooms throughout history has struggled to engage very young people, and then these young people grow up a little bit and get engaged. So, and with people, you know, living longer, it's obviously more of it. And there is definitely, in terms of, I mean, there's clearly much more savviness in, you know, teenagers about the sources that they use. You know, I've never heard an 18-year-old tell me, like, I read it on the internet, whereas I hear that a lot from, you know, 75-year-olds and so on. Oh, I just saw it on Facebook. This news was on Facebook, and so on. So yeah, I'm afraid I don't have the answers, but I do think you're onto something, and I think I don't think that generation will provide the answers to the questions of online disinformation, but I think it is something that may be worth focusing on. But I also wonder whether I am perhaps slightly wrongly optimistic, but I think I give the audiences a lot more credit than most people, and I do think that we're learning very hard lessons, and we're learning them a very hard way, but I think we are coming out of it smarter and more savvy, and harder for the media industry to satisfy, because, you know, we're suddenly facing smarter audiences that are harder to cater to.
I think my frustration is that they're targeted. Like, we forget this. We just make this assumption that this misinformation appears online, and it appears the same way to absolutely everyone, and then the over 60s are gullible enough to fall for it. Like, this is designed, the content is created and targeted and kind of distributed in a way that the agents behind it have every understanding of what they're doing. So most of this content is created to, built around emotion. So fear is a big part of this. And that age group have a lot to lose in principle. So whether it's home ownership or, you know, all of these divisive issues that we know when we see the tactics played out, it's kind of job security, home ownership, the thing that age group feels that they're losing. That's why they're targeted for these particular kinds of videos or memes or articles. It's deliberately sent to that age group on a specific platform in a way that they will be angry enough to share it. It's designed in that way, and I agree entirely. This idea that the public are gullible, you know, you'd be hard pressed if it's being targeted specifically at you, and it's been designed in a way to make it believable in a language that you use, framed in a manner that you understand. Then all of us are susceptible to being persuaded. For us, we look at that Zuckerberg video and say, of course that's not him. That's not designed or targeted for us. So, you know, there will be other things that I fall for and you will all fall for.
I think that I agree with you, Jenny, but I think what's interesting is the context. And the context for many audiences, but especially elderly audiences living outside metropolitan areas, is also the collapse in local journalism everywhere, which has led to this collapse in trust. And so not having that other source to fall back on, there being this vacuum in terms of local journalism, or in terms of journalism, what we would call on the ground outside the big metropolitan cities. So I think you also have to put it into that context where the journalism business and what's happened to us over the last 10 years has created this deficit of local reporting, which in turn has helped fuel this terrible lack of trust, which we're now seeing really at really crisis levels, notably in a country like France, which at the moment is going through ructions, which we've seen with the Yellow Vest movement and so on. And a lot of that is really about a collapse in trust between people living outside the metropolitan areas and what are really the big cities-based media.
Sorry, I'm jumping back in again. I did say to Olav that I talk too much and just to shut me down. But you just made me think about the way that this is packaged, because we're all now obsessed with creating AJ+, now this style, quick videos, because that's how people want to consume news on Facebook, forgetting that some of these conspiracy theory videos are 3 hours long, and you can really settle down with a cup of tea and a biscuit and get really involved, while the rest of the mainstream news industry is saying, we're going to make a 30-second package because that's what engages people. So in terms of age group and understanding, and exactly to Phil's point, we're not presenting it in a way anymore necessarily that is consumable or comfortable for them to consume.
I think it's a really good question to actually raise. The thing with democracy is that, people over the age of 65 are equally treated, right? So, and that's the scary thing. I mean, for us, we were actually last year, been developing this system that sort of gets people engaging and critically reading the news, and that helps to, train some of the algorithms that we're building out. And we did some surveys of over 65s versus, 20 to 30s and 20 to 24-year-olds, and we found that the same thing, but we found the case that young people really want to engage in solving this problem, right? Whether it's checking news, whether it's debating news content, and actually being involved in this wider problem of actually potentially also helping old people. We found that really interesting as an insight, as a product insight, that, when asked, like, would you like to build a system where you could help your grandparents, let's say, read the news? This was something that people really felt like was a really cool feature that they wanted.
Jenny, you mentioned the term fear, I think, which resonates even with elder people much more than maybe with younger ones, and also relates, I think, a little bit to, growing understanding in this whole online disinformation discourse that obviously values and beliefs trump knowledge. And many of the response mechanisms we are not only thinking of but implementing are pretty much talking to a rational argument and trying to debunk and explain to people why they are wrong. Do you think that really this addresses the confirmation bias and can convince someone who is not really convinced by facts, but just believes in something, maybe even like a cult or a religion, to think otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, Amy referred to an information war, and we do talk in those terms up to a point. I'm really interested how we all have started to use kind of more militaristic terms to address this, because this us and them divide is a big part of the problem. I think I'm interested in what role we can play realistically when the alternative media are calling themselves the alternative media and saying they are an investigative journalist for the alternative media. I think the more, we don't use the phrase F news at First Draft. We're trying to kind of dance around the idea of saying disputed information, specifically because even if we know it's not true, we have to accept it's in dispute, and is in any courtroom, you have to provide sufficient evidence to the person. If there was a jury who were completely undecided, you'd have one side, the alternative media, and then you'd have the mainstream media, and it's up to both sides to present evidence. And to my point about the 3-hour video, if you watch one of these conspiracy videos, they take great care in providing evidence. We could debunk that evidence in a heartbeat, but are we doing enough as mainstream organizations to provide evidence to support our own reporting and our own investigations, that transparency piece, or the assumption that people will trust us because we are who we are, when actually the efforts that they're going to on the other side, if we're talking us and them, which we shouldn't, they are disputing this, and they're presenting all sorts of ways, to convince people. So that's the biggest challenge.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, I think what they do quite well is engaged, and they tell the story. And I think this whole obsession with fact-checking, I find it a little bit puzzling, because I just always assumed that was just part of the job. It's as if we suddenly discovered fact-checking. Aren't we supposed to be fact-checking? Like, I didn't realize this was up for discussion. But I think, and I think the problem with debunking is that it's incredibly reactive. And the minute you start being reactive, you are in a losing position. I kind of feel like we're in the same way in sort of industry's relationship with the platforms is also very reactive. So I think as, we need to, as journalists and as reporters and editors, but also as an industry as a whole, we need to start coming up with ways when we're actually proactive and are setting the agenda and setting the stories. And I think people really react to that. And then there is this matter of telling the stories well, which, I just had, there's this like whole thing in the US of like, oh, storytelling can be bad, like post-Spiegel, oh, storytelling is a bad thing. And I had an argument about it with Jeff Jarvis, who's, saying it should all be about verification and fact-checking. But the thing is, a lot of really good journalism is lost in a badly told story. And unless we tell this like compelling narratives, it will be really, becomes very hard to get through to the audience.
But can you pull over anti-vaxxers by fact-checking and rational argument? I mean, that's one of the questions.
We do a lot of fact-checking. I think I don't like the word or the phrase fact-checking. I don't think it's helpful. It doesn't really sort of explain what we do. I think what is interesting with that is more what I would call digital investigations and verification. In that now, increasingly, there are really two worlds, and you have to work in both worlds. There's your journalism of your people on the ground reporting on what's happening. But if you're not reporting what is happening on the net, on the web, on social media, in 4chan, in 8chan, at the same time, you are missing a large part of the story. And again, if I refer back to the yellow vest crisis in France, the entire mainstream media said they were surprised by what happened, but they shouldn't have been surprised, because if you were really digitally reporting, if you were inside social media, verifying what was going on, reporting, you would have seen these Facebook groups emerging where this would have come from. So I take your point about fact-checking, because I get the same questions from my own reporters saying, we fact-check all the time, why are we doing fact-checking? It's not a helpful phrase in a way, but what I think it is important is creating a much bigger culture of verification and a much bigger culture of saying, well, what is the truth? I think for a long time, the traditional media really bears some responsibility for this, of really this false balance. The famous thing is George Bush says the earth is flat. Democrats say, no, it's not, and the story becomes, dispute over state of earth, when someone's just told someone that's untrue. So I think, that the culture of journalism being forced to verify things in real time, it's no good putting out something which somebody says which may be false, and then the next day doing a story to react to that. But really creating a culture where everybody is asking all the time that information that they're dealing with in real time, is that true? Is that verified? Can that be contextualized even in real time? That I would call fact-checking too.
So I just want to add the tech startup sort of side of things on this is and actually on the platform side. I think there's two strands of how we think about, let's say, anti-vaccination, and one of them is actually thinking about how this content actually reaches and it gets distributed to that user. Which essentially is a ranking algorithm, right? It's a ranking and search system, and it's giving you all sorts of different signals on that content that says, this is this piece of content that should go to that reader right now, and it should go above that other piece of content based on these signals. So in that sense, people often get confused that this is stuff happening at the back end of these platforms. You're not seeing any verification, you're not seeing any sort of human processes, you're just seeing a system that starts to potentially de-rank that anti-vaccination content. So that's one side of the argument. Who's working on that? Is that something that we should be pushing forward, where old people don't even realize that they're seeing less of this content? Or is it the second strand, which is providing context? So these are all these things that you see the platforms doing, where you're adding sort of Wikipedia information buttons and providing other stories on the other side of the coin. I think those are those two strands of approaches that at least we as a company think about, and I think it's a two-pronged approach that we need to take.
I was kind of surprised, but also kind of, convinced in a way by reading a blog post of a pediatrician from the US the other day who proposes to use conspiracy theories to combat conspiracy theories. So what he does when he is confronted, like on his, daily business with, staunch anti-vaxxer moms, he would tell them, have you ever thought that this is a plot of the Russians and Chinese to reduce our population? And this sometimes works. Right, so we have a couple of minutes left for questions, and I reckon that we have 2 mics on both aisles. So who goes first? Over there, the woman in the white shirt. And just please introduce yourself quickly.
Hello. Hi, I'm Angie Pitt from Newswise at the Guardian Foundation. I was interested in what you were saying about adult news literacy. That's an area that we've started to work on delivering sessions, and we've done a ton of research into the most successful models of adult news literacy, especially senior citizens. And we know that the most impactful involve face-to-face interaction and sessions over a longer period of time to build trust, to try and undo biases that have been established over a long time. And obviously that costs a lot of money. So my question is, who should pay?
Anyone?
I'll get it. It's fine. I think the point I was making when that question was asked about how, like, in democracy, over 65s, it's the same weighting on the vote, right? So I think actually, in my opinion, it's something that where, again, on the regulation side, I'm actually a little bit, I think the government should be stepping in this. In that case, it's not about regulation, it's about training, and it's about rebuilding trust in how we think about information. I think that's where I think the funding should be coming from for that.
I think that there should be a business model in it. This idea that everything should be funded drives me a bit crackers. I think ultimately there should be a commercial incentive for newsrooms to find a different way to speak to those audiences and gain that loyalty based on the fact they're delivering news in a way that is, welcome. There always should be a commercial incentive to make anything sustainable. So I would challenge you all to think through and find out what that research is and adapt accordingly, because I think there is a business model there.
Plus, talking about empty chairs, I've been to quite a few conferences around online disinformation, and at no instance was ever advertisers involved, and I think they also kind of belong to the equation, to put it mildly. Yeah. Any other questions maybe on this end? Right there?
Yes. Hi. I work for the European Union, of Fundamental Rights, actually. My question is regarding to the code of conduct that the EU has actually put on first. It was, of course, it was the platforms, the one that decided themselves to sign to it. But it seems like last year they have really increased by half-fold the amount of hate speech, for example, that they have removed from online platforms. Is this a way to go? Because the previous speaker was saying that regulations is not the way to go, and I'm wondering what you think about it. What can, in this regard, institutions like, for example, the European Union do, from your point of view, to stop or to help actually this mistrust in news, which is actually idea what is happening, and how can we support quality journalism? Because this is what we need, quality journalism as a pillar of democracy. Thank you.
Well, I can't talk for ages about it because I was a member of the high-level group that drew up this solution, which I think failed to a large extent, mainly because self-regulation only does not work either. So it's really probably at the end of the day a question of connecting threads, at least, of legislation and self-regulatory measures into one. And I'm not exactly sure if we are there yet with the European Union.
From my perspective, as fact matter, people often ask, why are you building AI to tackle hate speech or sexism or racism or news quality? Surely the big platforms are working on this, right? They've got big AI teams, and so why do we even exist? I think that I'm not for this idea that platforms build their own tools and systems in different ways without any sort of regulation or oversight. I think what the European Union can do is start to actually create some standardization of what something like a hate speech system could look like, right? That's my view, and I think that's what we exist to actually somehow.
So is that more of like algorithm regulation?
I don't think just in algorithm regulation, but for example, what is the definition of hate speech in different countries? What is deemed as fine or not fine? Because people are actually taking those rules and building like automated mass scale systems on top of those things.
Which
and people don't
kind
know what those rules are.
Which is kind of a whole new discussion, I believe. But great conversation, thank you very much. The beauty of the first day is that we'll be still around for a couple of days, so hit us up, whatever questions or points you have to raise with all of us. The problem now for me is to recommend the next session with my friends Scott and Vivian and Mirko, but also at the same time recommend to go upstairs and meet both Jenny and myself with the workshop. So you decide. See you later. Thank you very much.
Oh, that's a tough one. That is a tough one. Olaf team, thank you so much. That was really interesting. Thank you. I really appreciate that. So we've now got 2 competing sessions.